The accordion wailed in the community hall when Betty felt the sharp smell of whiskey rising from the man beside her. Her simple cotton dress clung to her body with nervous sweat, and she clutched her small purse so tightly her knuckles ached. Joe Anthony's voice was too loud, his laugh too forced, his hand too heavy on her shoulder. People were staring. They always stared. But now they stared differently, with that malicious curiosity of folks who know they're witnessing something bound to go wrong. The pastor called for the blessing, and Betty closed her eyes, trying to find courage in the familiar words. That's when she heard the back door creak. She opened her eyes slowly, as if afraid of what she'd find. It was him. The cowboy with the low-brimmed hat who showed up at rodeos, never talked to anyone, and was respected by all without anyone knowing exactly why. He walked between the plastic chairs with the confident stride of someone who knows every stone in the path. Silence fell over the hall like dust after a stampede. Even the accordion didn't dare hum. Betty's heart pounded in her throat when she saw the hand extended toward her. A calloused hand, scarred from honest work, clean despite the dirt under the nails. Joe Anthony's face flushed red, the whiskey on his breath mixing with anger. "What do you think you're doing, Rafe?" His voice came out choked, weaker than he intended. Rafe didn't answer. He kept his hand extended, looking straight into Betty's eyes. It was as if the rest of the world had vanished, as if it were just the two of them in that moment that could change everything. She looked at his hand, his face, the whispering crowd. Miss Eulalie, Joe Anthony's aunt, stood up from the front row, her chest puffed with indignation. "Young man, you're interrupting a ceremony. This woman is already spoken for." Rafe finally spoke, his voice low, gravelly but steady as a taut fence wire. "Spoken for by who? Did she say anything?" Betty felt her legs tremble. She was there out of necessity, not choice. The boarding house where she lived was expensive. Her seamstress work barely covered rent. And when Joe Anthony made his proposal through Miss Eulalie, it seemed like her only way out. A house of her own, food on the table, stability. The price was marrying a man who drank too much and whom she barely knew. But it was that or return to her family in the countryside, head bowed, admitting she couldn't make it on her own in town. She started, but her voice was so soft no one heard. "Speak up, woman!" Joe Anthony grabbed her arm. "Tell this jerk you've already made your choice." Rafe took a step forward, and Joe Anthony let go of her arm instantly. It wasn't fear. It was the instinctive respect some men command without needing to threaten anyone. Rafe had that gift, that presence that made others choose their words carefully. "Betty," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice. "Do you want to come with me?" The entire hall held its breath. Betty looked around at the familiar faces awaiting her answer. Old Man Jim, the saddle maker who always greeted her on the street. Miss Mary from the boarding house, who came to the ceremony more out of curiosity than friendship. Little Pete, the neighbor's kid, who always ran when he saw horses pass by. All of them there, judging, waiting, deciding what was right for her life. "I don't know," she said, in a sincerity that startled her. Rafe nodded, as if that was the most honest answer he could have hoped for. He lowered his hand slowly. "Then it's not today," he said. "But when you know, I'll be around." He left as he'd come, unhurried, without drama. Just the sound of his boots on the old wooden floor and the lingering scent of leather and open fields. Joe Anthony tried to resume the ceremony, but the pastor was flustered. The crowd whispered too loudly, and Miss Eulalie wore that look of someone who'd have plenty to say later. "Let's get out of here." Joe Anthony pulled Betty by the arm. "These gossipers will be talking for weeks." On the walk back to the boarding house, he rambled on. That Rafe was a meddler, had no right to barge into a ceremony, that everyone knew he had a drinking problem too, just hid it better. Betty listened without responding, thinking of the outstretched hand, the simple question, the strange feeling of being asked about her own life for the first time in ages. "You'll regret listening to that bum." Joe Anthony stopped at the boarding house gate. "I'm offering you a real marriage, a house, a decent life. What can he offer? The guy doesn't even have a fixed address." "How do you know that?" Betty asked. "Everyone knows. He drifts from ranch to ranch, working as a hand. Owns nothing, builds nothing, plants nothing. Like a drifter, always moving." Betty entered the boarding house without saying goodbye. In the small room she shared with another girl, she stared out the window at the empty street. The full moon lit up the low houses and yards full of clotheslines. It was a simple life, but it had been her choice, or at least it had been, before the money ran out and her options dwindled. The next morning, she woke to Miss Mary knocking on her door. "Betty, there's a man downstairs wanting to talk to you." Her heart raced. Was it Rafe? She hurried down the stairs and found Old Man Jim, the saddle maker, sipping coffee in the kitchen. "Morning, girl. I've got a proposition for you." She sat at the table, curious and relieved at the same time. "I need someone to help in my workshop. Someone who can sew and has steady hands. I saw your work on those cushions you made for Miss Carmen. They're a beauty. But Mr. Jim, I don't know anything about leather or saddles. Leather's leather, fabric's fabric. The stitching's almost the same, just a different needle and thread. I'll teach you the rest. You up for working out back at the boarding house? Miss Mary's already okayed it." It was as if the universe was offering a third option just when she thought she only had two. Working with Old Man Jim would pay better than her odd sewing jobs, and she could keep living at the boarding house without relying on marriage to Joe Anthony. "I'm in." Old Man Jim grinned, showing teeth yellowed from chewing tobacco. "Great. Start tomorrow. And girl, don't let anyone pressure you. Rushed decisions usually turn out bad." She spent the day setting up a corner in the back of the boarding house, where Old Man Jim brought the basic equipment. It was a small space, but the smell of fresh leather and saddle soap calmed her in a strange way. There was something honest about that work, something that made sense in a way the arranged marriage didn't. Late that afternoon, she was testing a heavier needle when she saw Rafe leaning against the back fence. He was watching the street, but she knew he'd come to talk to her. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat. "Afternoon." They stayed like that for a few minutes, her pretending to be busy with the needle, him staring at the horizon where the sun was starting to set. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt like they'd known each other forever. "You made a decision then," he said, not as a question. "I decided to try a different path." "And Joe Anthony?" Betty jabbed the needle into the leather harder than necessary. "He'll have to understand I'm not a package to be ordered." Rafe nodded but lingered a while longer. When he finally walked away, he left something on the fence post, a small wildflower, the kind that grows in the fields without anyone planting it. Betty waited until he disappeared around the corner to pick it up and tuck it between the pages of the notebook where she recorded her service prices. That night, Joe Anthony showed up at the boarding house, drunk. Miss Mary wouldn't let him upstairs, so they talked on the porch, with some neighbors pretending not to eavesdrop. "You're making a mistake, Betty. This leather workshop thing won't work out. Women don't have the strength for heavy materials. And what'll people say, a woman doing a man's job? The same people who talked when you showed up drunk at the last church potluck." Joe Anthony's face reddened. "That was one time, and I've quit drinking." "Since when?" "Since I'm quitting. I will quit." Betty sighed. It was always like this. Vague promises, good intentions that lasted until the next temptation. She knew this kind of man. She'd grown up watching her father make the same promises to her mother. "Joe Anthony, I don't want to get married right now. Not to you, not to anyone. I want to work, save money, have my independence." "Independence?" He laughed bitterly. "A woman alone doesn't have independence. She has loneliness and gossip behind her back. You'll see." He stormed off, slamming the gate, and Betty stayed on the porch, watching the stars begin to appear. Miss Mary brought her a cup of chamomile tea. "Don't mind him, girl. A man scorned talks nonsense. Old Man Jim's a good guy. He'll teach you right. And honest work never hurt anyone. Miss Mary, do you think I'm doing the right thing?" The older woman sat beside her on the wooden bench. "Child, I married at 17 to a man my father picked. He was a good man, hard-working, respected me. But I never knew what it was like to choose for myself. I always wonder how it would have been if I'd had the courage you're showing now. And if it goes wrong? What if it goes right?" Betty smiled for the first time in weeks. That was it. What if it went right? What if she could support herself, make her own choices, build a life that made sense to her? The idea was scary, but it also brought a warm feeling to her chest, like she'd discovered she could fly and just needed to leap off the branch. The first week of work left her fingers raw. Leather was tougher than fabric, the needle heavier, the stitches needed to be firmer. But each finished piece brought a different kind of satisfaction. It was solid, durable, made to last years. Like she was building something that would endure. Old Man Jim was patient, teaching her the tricks of the trade, sharing stories from when he made saddles for big ranchers in the area. He talked about special leathers, techniques he'd learned from his father, clients who came back because they trusted his work. The secret, girl, is patience. Leather doesn't lie. If you rush, it shows. If you take care, it stays beautiful forever. By the end of the second week, she was finishing a simple harness when Rafe showed up at the workshop. He brought a different piece of leather, softer, lighter. Calfskin, he explained. Good for finer work. He handed it to her, and when their hands touched for a second, Betty felt a shiver run up her arm. Rafe seemed to feel it too, because he pulled his hand back too slowly. "You gonna charge me for this leather?" she asked. "Consider it an investment," he said, and left the workshop, leaving behind that smell of open fields and the sense that something important was starting to happen. Betty stared at the leather in her hands, thinking about all the changes in the past weeks. Life had taken a turn she hadn't expected, but it felt more hers than any path she'd followed before. And for the first time in a long time, she was curious about what came next. The calfskin Rafe brought became a small, delicate purse with stitches that looked like patterns on the soft surface. Betty worked on it for 3 nights straight by lamplight, testing different stitches until she found the prettiest one. When she finished, she felt a pride unlike anything she'd ever made. It was like she'd discovered a hidden talent within herself. Old Man Jim examined the purse the next morning, turning it over, testing the stitch's strength. "Girl, you've got a blessed hand for this. This work's worth 3 times what I charge for a regular harness." "You really think so?" "Think? I know. And guess who's going to buy this beauty? The doc's wife. She's been looking for something special for the mayor's daughter's wedding." Betty's stomach churned with nerves. The doctor's wife was one of the town's most important people, the kind who set trends and whose opinions mattered. What if she doesn't like it? She'll like it. And she'll want to order more, you'll see. That afternoon, Miss Eulalie showed up at the workshop looking sour. Betty was cutting leather strips for reins when she saw the woman standing in the doorway, eyeing everything with disapproval. "Afternoon, Miss Eulalie." "Afternoon, I came to talk to you, girl." Betty set her work aside and invited the woman to sit in a wicker chair Old Man Jim had left there. Miss Eulalie sat with the stiff posture of someone here for serious business. "You know why I'm here. I'm guessing it's about Joe Anthony." "Exactly. That boy's suffering because of you. He's not sleeping right, not eating right, can't focus on work, and worst of all, he's drinking more than he should." Betty felt a pang of guilt, but kept cutting the leather strips carefully. "I didn't make him drink, Miss Eulalie." "You didn't make him, but you're not helping either. You know he proposed because he really likes you, and you know you won't find better out there. Are you sure he likes me, or does he just like the idea of having someone to keep house and put up with his drinking?" Miss Eulalie's face flushed. "What kind of disrespect is that?" "It's not disrespect, it's an honest question. How many times have you seen Joe Anthony sober around me? How many times has he asked what I like, what I think, what I want from life?" The older woman was quiet for a moment, and Betty knew she'd hit a nerve. "Marriage isn't child's play, girl. It's responsibility. It's commitment. Not this nonsense about waiting for Prince Charming. I'm not waiting for Prince Charming. I'm waiting to be treated like a person, not a solution to someone else's problems." Miss Eulalie stood, adjusted her purse, and gave Betty a once-over. "You'll regret this stubbornness. A woman who plays too hard to get ends up an old maid. And this little job of yours," she gestured dismissively at the workshop, "this isn't a life for a decent woman." She left, leaving a heavy silence. Betty kept cutting leather, but her hands trembled slightly. Miss Eulalie's words echoed, stirring old fears. What if she was being too stubborn? What if she ended up alone? What if this workshop failed? That's when little Pete came running, out of breath. "Aunt Betty, Aunt Betty." The kid had called her that since he was little. Betty smiled, her first since Miss Eulalie's visit. "What is it, Pete?" "My mum wants to know if you can teach her to make those little purses like the one you made. She wants to sell them at the fair." "Of course I can. Tell her to come by tomorrow morning." Pete ran off and Betty felt lighter. Maybe Miss Eulalie was wrong. Maybe there was room for women like her who wanted to work with their hands and choose their own paths. The next week, the doctor's wife not only bought the purse, but ordered 3 more. She brought 2 friends interested in the work. The workshop behind the boarding house started feeling too small, and Betty found herself working late, her hands growing more skilled and confident. One of those nights, as she finished a dark leather purse with gold details, she heard footsteps in the yard. She looked out the window and saw Rafe leaning against the fence, as if waiting for her to notice him. "Evening," he said when she stepped out to talk. "Evening. It's late for you to be wandering around. I was passing by and saw your light on. You work too much." Betty leaned against the workshop door, tired but content. "I love what I do. It's been a while since I felt that." Rafe nodded, as if he knew exactly what she meant. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Why did you do that at the ceremony? Why'd you interrupt?" Rafe was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was softer than usual. "Because I've seen women handed off like cattle. You didn't deserve that. You don't know me. I know enough." There was something in his voice, an old pain that made Betty want to ask more. But Rafe was already stepping away from the fence. "Rafe, wait." He stopped, but didn't turn. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a chance to choose." He turned then, and even in the dim light she saw him smile. "The choice was always yours, Betty. I just helped you remember that." The next day, news swept through town. A special rodeo was set for the end of the month, with cash prizes and competitors from out of town. It'd bring crowds, tourists, buyers, a perfect chance to show off their work. Old Man Jim was thrilled. "Girl, we can set up a booth there. Show our work to folks from outside. Bet we sell everything." Betty liked the idea, but knew she'd need more pieces ready. She worked like crazy, waking before dawn, sleeping past midnight. Her hands got small cuts, her back ached from hunching over, but each finished piece was a victory. Joe Anthony showed up twice during those hectic weeks. The first time he was sober, bringing wildflowers and an apology. "Betty, I know I was harsh the other day. I was jealous of that Rafe, but I'm changing. I stopped drinking, started going to the church group for help with that." Betty accepted the flowers and apology, but made no promises. "I'm glad you're taking care of yourself, Joe Anthony, but you've got to do that for you, not me. I'm doing it for both of us, for when you're ready to give me a chance." The second time, 3 weeks later, he was drunk again. The support group worked for a few days, then he skipped, then stopped going. The relapse was bad, and he showed up at the workshop yelling, drawing the neighbors' attention. "You're making a fool of yourself, Betty. Working like a slave for what? To prove what? That you're strong, independent? Nonsense. A woman needs a man by her side, needs protection. You're drunk, Joe Anthony, go home." "I'm drunk, yeah, and you know why? Because the woman I want to marry is playing hard to get, listening to a bum who doesn't even have a house." Miss Mary appeared at the boarding house door, worried about the noise. "Mr. Joe Anthony, you're disturbing my guests. Please leave." "I'll leave, all right, but only because I want to. And you, Betty, when you're tired of this nonsense, come find me. I won't wait forever." He stumbled off, and Betty's hands shook with anger and embarrassment. The neighbors whispered, and she knew the whole town would be talking tomorrow. "Don't mind the gossip, child." Miss Mary put a hand on her shoulder. "Those who know you know what kind of person you are." But the gossip hurt. It hurt because part of Betty sometimes wondered if Miss Eulalie and Joe Anthony were right, if she was too proud, too demanding, too stubborn, if she was throwing away a chance at a stable life for foolish dreams of independence. It was Rafe who found her crying in the workshop that night, after everyone else had gone to bed. He didn't ask what happened or offer advice. He just sat on the floor beside her chair and stayed there, silent, until she stopped crying. "Sometimes I think they're right," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "That I'm being foolish, that I should have just accepted the marriage and been done with it. And what do you think?" "I think I'm scared." "Scared of what?" Betty looked at her calloused hands, the small but organized workshop, the leather pieces that represented hours of work and sleepless nights. "Scared of being wrong. Scared of ending up alone and regretful at 40. Scared all this struggle won't be worth it in the end." Rafe was quiet for a while, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "You know the difference between you and Joe Anthony?" "What?" "You're building something. He's just trying to take what's already made." Betty looked at him and saw beyond the surface for the first time. The lines around his eyes, the hands worn from hard work, the loneliness he carried like a heavy but necessary burden. "And you, Rafe, what are you building?" He smiled, but it was a sad smile, still figuring that out. They stayed there late, talking about small dreams and big fears, the weight of choices, and the cost of freedom. When Rafe finally left, Betty felt less alone than she had in years. The rodeo week hit like a tornado. The town transformed, filled with strangers, horses, dust, and bustle. Betty and Old Man Jim set up their booth early, arranging the pieces carefully. Purses, belts, wallets, coin pouches, all made with the special leather Rafe brought and others they'd gotten from local ranchers. Business started slow, but when the first customer loudly praised their work, others crowded in. By the end of the first day, they'd sold over half their stock. Betty was exhausted but happier than she could remember. That's when she saw Rafe approaching the booth, with an older, well-dressed man who looked at everything with a professional eye. "Betty, I want you to meet Mr. Anthony Charles. He owns a leather goods store in the city." The man examined the pieces carefully, testing stitches, feeling the material's quality. "Fine work," he said finally. "Did you do all this yourself?" With Old Man Jim's guidance, Betty nodded toward the saddle maker, who was helping other customers. "Interesting. Ever thought about supplying bigger stores? I've got clients who'd pay well for this quality." Betty's heart raced. It was more than she'd dreamed, more than she'd dared hope. She glanced at Rafe, who was smiling that quiet smile of his, and realized this wasn't a coincidence. He'd brought the man here on purpose. "How's it work?" she asked. "We place an initial order, you deliver, and if it goes well, we increase it, simple as that." When the man left after taking their contact info and placing the first order, Betty turned to Rafe. "Why'd you do this?" "Because you deserve for people to see your work. But you barely know me, why do you care?" Rafe looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories. "Maybe because we've known each other longer than you think." Before she could ask what he meant, the accordion announced the start of the competitions and he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Betty with a racing heart and a feeling that she was about to uncover something big about her own past. Rafe's words echoed in Betty's mind all night. "We've known each other longer than you think." What did he mean? She racked her brain, searching for any memory of him from before, but nothing came. Just that strange sense of familiarity she'd felt since their first meeting, like her heart recognized someone her mind had forgotten. The second day of the rodeo brought a shock that had the whole town buzzing. Joe Anthony had signed up for the bull riding competition. Him who hadn't ridden anything wilder than a tame mare in years. People whispered it was desperation, an attempt to get Betty's attention, to prove something. "That man's going to get himself hurt bad." Miss Mary shook her head, worried. "And then they'll say it's your fault." Betty's stomach churned. She didn't want Joe Anthony hurt, but she couldn't be responsible for his reckless choices. She decided to go to the rodeo, more to work the booth than out of curiosity. But when she got there, she learned Old Man Jim had fallen ill overnight and couldn't come. "Go anyway," he insisted from his sickbed. "Rafe said he'd stop by to help if you need it." Rafe's name made Betty's heart skip. Since the night before, she couldn't get him out of her head. There was something about him that intrigued her, drew her in a way she couldn't explain. It was different from anything she'd felt before. The booth was busy when Rafe arrived mid-morning, carrying an old worn leather satchel. "Brought something for you to see," he said, setting it on the counter. Betty looked inside and found old papers, yellowed letters, and at the bottom, a small faded photograph. When she picked it up, the ground seemed to vanish beneath her. It was her as a child, next to a blonde boy, both on a bay horse. In the background, a wooden house she recognized instantly. Her grandfather's ranch, where she'd spent a few summers as a kid before her family moved away. "My God," she whispered, staring at Rafe with wide eyes. "You're little Rafe." He nodded slowly, with that sad smile she was starting to know well. "Thought you'd never remember." The memories flooded back like water breaking a dam. The blonde boy who taught her to ride, showed her bird nests hidden in the woods, promised to marry her when they grew up. The same boy who cried when she left with her family, vowing he'd find her one day. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Her voice cracked with emotion. "Because you'd forgotten, and I wasn't sure it was fair to bring back memories better left in the past." Betty touched his face gently, as if relearning every feature. "I didn't forget. I just buried it deep. You were my best friend, and you were the girl who showed me the world could be beautiful." They were so wrapped up in each other, they didn't notice Joe Anthony approach the booth. He was dressed for the competition, but the whiskey smell was strong even from a distance. "What a touching scene," he slurred. The little lady reuniting with her childhood sweetheart. Betty stepped back from Rafe but didn't let go of his hand. Joe Anthony, you're drunk. You shouldn't compete like this. I'm fine enough to ride any bull they put in front of me, and fine enough to spot betrayal when I see it. What betrayal? I never promised you anything. You did. The day you accepted my proposal. I never accepted any proposal. Your aunt made that up. Rafe stepped forward, positioning himself between Betty and Joe Anthony. You need to calm down. And you need to stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. The argument was drawing a crowd. Betty knew she had to do something before it spiraled out of control. Listen here, Joe Anthony, she said firmly. You want a straight answer? Here it is. I'm not marrying you. Not today, not ever. Not because you drink, not because you've got flaws, but because I don't love you and you don't love me. You just want a woman to take care of you, and I'm not that woman. Joe Anthony's face burned with rage. You'll regret this. You'll see what it's like to be alone with no one to protect you. She's not alone, Rafe said, low but firm, and she won't be. Joe Anthony glared at them with hatred, spat on the ground, and stormed toward the corrals where the competition was being set up. Betty was shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally saying everything she needed to. You okay? Rafe asked, holding her hands. I am. For the first time in a long time, I'm okay. The bull riding competition started an hour later. Betty wanted to ignore it and keep working the booth, but she couldn't focus, knowing Joe Anthony was about to do something stupid. When his name was called over the loudspeaker, her stomach twisted. Let's go watch, Rafe said. You don't need to stay here worrying alone. They reached the arena just as Joe Anthony climbed onto the bull. Even from a distance, it was clear he could barely balance. The bull was one of the biggest and meanest in the rodeo, known for throwing off seasoned, sober cowboys. He's gonna kill himself, Betty whispered. The gate opened, and the bull exploded out like a demon, bucking and spinning with a violence that made the whole crowd hold its breath. Joe Anthony lasted 3 seconds before being flung into the air like a rag doll. He landed hard, motionless in the dirt. The rodeo clowns rushed to distract the bull while medics ran in. Betty raced down from the stands, Rafe right behind her. Joe Anthony was conscious, but clearly hurt, clutching his right leg, which was bent at an odd angle. When he saw Betty approach, he tried to smile. Got your attention, he said weakly. You're an idiot, Joe Anthony. I know, always have been. At the town hospital, they learned he'd broken his leg in 2 places and dislocated his shoulder. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to keep him laid up for weeks. Miss Eulalie arrived soon after in tears, blaming Betty for everything. This is your fault. He did this foolishness because of you. Now who's going to take care of him? I will, Betty said, surprising everyone, including herself. You, not as a wife or fiancée, but as a friend, as a neighbor, as a decent person who doesn't abandon someone in need. Joe Anthony looked at her with teary eyes. Why would you do that? Because it's the right thing to do. For the next 2 weeks, Betty split her time between the workshop and caring for Joe Anthony. She brought him food, helped with his meds, talked about simple things. In those talks, she discovered a side of him she hadn't known. When sober and vulnerable, he was funny, smart, even sensitive. You know, I always knew you didn't love me, right? He said one afternoon while she adjusted his pillows. Then why'd you keep pushing for marriage? Because I thought if you accepted me, it'd be enough. I thought love would come later, with time. And why'd you stop drinking when I was around at first? Joe Anthony sighed. Because I wanted to be better for you. But then you rejected me anyway, and I thought, if being better doesn't matter, then why not be worse? Joe Anthony, you've got to be better for yourself, not for anyone else. I know that now. During one of those visits, he made a confession that changed everything. Betty, there's something you need to know about that engagement deal. What about it? It wasn't me who approached you first. It was Miss Eulalie who suggested it, after she heard you were struggling at the boarding house. Betty stopped arranging his meds and stared at him. What do you mean? She said she knew a good girl who needed a husband. Said you'd accept because you had no choice. I went along with it. You're saying I was treated like a charity case. Not charity, but kind of. Betty felt a quiet rage rise in her chest. Not at Joe Anthony, who was at least being honest now, but at the manipulation, the way she'd been treated like a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. And you went along with it? At the time, yeah. I thought I was solving my problem, and yours at the same time. But after I got to know you better, saw how strong you are, how you've got your own mind, I felt bad, real bad. That night, Betty told Rafe about the revelation. They were in the workshop working together on a big order from the city. "You surprised?" he asked. "Not really. Miss Eulalie's always been the type to control other people's lives, but I feel used." "And now? What do you want to do?" Betty stopped stitching and looked at him. "I want to build a life that's my choice from start to finish. I want to expand the workshop, start a cooperative with other women who can sew. I want us to work together, but as partners, not because someone decided for us." Rafe smiled. "Got room for a cowboy who knows leather in that cooperative?" "Depends. Can he sign his own name?" "He can learn. Then there's room." 3 months later, the cooperative had 7 members. Betty, Rafe, Old Man Jim, Pete's mom, 2 friends from the boarding house, and, to everyone's surprise, Joe Anthony. After his leg healed, he came to Betty with a different proposal. "I know I'm not the right guy for you," he said, "but I'm a good salesman when I'm not drinking. How about I handle the business side of the cooperative? And the drinking? I joined a real program this time. Not for a woman, not for marriage. For me. And if it doesn't work out, then you fire me. Simple as that." The cooperative grew fast. The work that started in a small workshop behind the boarding house became a proper store on Main Street. Betty found she had a knack for organizing, teaching, leading. Rafe showed skills beyond leather. He was good with numbers, suppliers, tough clients. At the end of the year, when the rains returned and the fields turned green again, they threw a party to celebrate the cooperative's first anniversary. The whole town was invited, even Miss Eulalie, who showed up dressed in black like she was going to a funeral, but ended up buying 3 purses before leaving. "I'll admit," she said to Betty, "you proved you knew what you were doing. Thank you, Miss Eulalie. But I still think a married woman's happier than a single one." Betty smiled, glancing at Rafe, who was chatting with Old Man Jim near the counter. "You're right. A married woman is happier, but only when she marries for love, not necessity." That night, after the guests left and they finished cleaning the store, Rafe finally asked the question he'd been holding for months. "Betty, you remember that promise I made when we were kids?" "I do. Still good?" She stepped closer, placing her hands on the face she'd learned to love again, as an adult this time. "Depends. You gonna propose here in the store, like a businessman?" "Nope. I'll propose where it all started." The next morning, Rafe took Betty to her grandfather's old ranch, now owned by an out-of-town family. He'd gotten permission to visit the place where they'd played as kids. The house was different, painted a new color, but the big tree where they used to sit was still there, bigger and fuller. Under that tree, Rafe knelt in the red dirt and opened a small box with a simple gold ring. "Betty, will you marry me? Not because you need to, not because someone decided for you, but because we chose each other?" She looked at the man who'd been her first friend, her first love, and now her partner in work and life. She thought about the past year, the fears, the struggles, the victories, the discoveries, the workshop that became a cooperative, the women who found independence through work, the future they'd built together, brick by brick. "I will," she said, "but on one condition." "What's that?" "We get married in the church, but after the ceremony, instead of a party, we work. We've got a big order due next week." Rafe laughed, that genuine laugh she'd learned to draw out of him. "Only you'd turn a honeymoon into a workday." "That's because I learned something, Rafe. There's nothing more romantic than building a life with the one you love." And when he kissed her there, under the tree where it all began, Betty knew she'd made the right choices. It hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been hers, and that made all the difference. The wedding happened 3 months later, simple but beautiful. Joe Anthony was a groomsman, sober for 6 months, and dating a girl from the next town over. Miss Eulalie cried through the whole ceremony, but later told anyone who'd listen that she always knew those two would end up together. When the accordion played the first song at the reception, it wasn't a farewell. It was a beginning. A story that started in childhood, weathered the pain of separation, the fight for independence, and arrived at a mature love between 2 people who knew happy endings don't fall from the sky. They're built day by day with work, respect, and the courage to choose each other every day. During the last dance, with the smell of rain in the air and the first stars appearing, Betty rested her head on Rafe's chest and felt she was finally home, not in a house of bricks and a roof, but in the certainty of having found someone she could be fully herself with. And when the music ended, and they returned to the cooperative with work waiting, she knew this was just the start of a story they'd write together, stitch by stitch, like a carefully crafted piece of leatherwork.